2, 3, 4. Okay, so looks to me like we might be short 4 or 5 people. It's like maybe 3 screens. This is going to be quite exciting for those of you who are new to Zoom, which I don't think really is going to be that many of you, if any. A couple really important things for you to be aware of. One is that number one, when you are on or off of mute, I should say, when you are off of mute, when your microphone does not have a red slash through it, we can hear everything going on in your space. So for the most part, I will take advantage of co-host technology to have everyone on mute when I'm speaking or presenting, and when if I show video, if the video is running. That being said, I cannot unmute you, but I can ask you to unmute. You have to take yourself off mute. So when we do have discussion, or if you have a question, please feel free to take yourself off mute and ask that question. I will get into more detail about how I facilitate as a teacher. If we were all in a classroom together, I would just tell you, just ask me a question if it comes up. The same thing is true on Zoom. It's just, again, you have to take that extra step of clicking on the microphone icon, which is at the bottom of whatever screen you might be using. A few things also about Zoom. I wrote to many of you to say, like, we picked this time because it's a time when we are maybe available, but also dealing with other things at the same time, right? It's a early dinner for some, it's a late dinner for others. I'm trying to squeeze in opportunities for people who maybe have to put other people to bed. And so if you have to do things that you don't want everyone to watch you do, by all means, turn off your video. You can just click on the video icon, which is next to the microphone icon, and that will turn off your video. I see 4 videos or 5 are actually off. That's fine. But right, again, in the spirit of creating community, which I'll say more about in a little bit, it's okay for us to see you take a sip of tea, have some hot chocolate, maybe to actually be, actually eating dinner or something to that effect, because the whole point is for us to be together. One more thing about Zoom is that you can, for the most part, control who is actually not just necessarily seeing you, but how you're seeing everybody else. There's gallery view, and there's also speaker view. Okay, and for what it's worth, I'm going to spotlight myself when I'm speaking, which will kind of override a lot of that. And when I share my screen, you can play around with how many other people you're looking at by going to the gallery view. But again, when I'm speaking, I will be the primary screen that you'll be seeing. Okay, I think I stalled enough for most of our latecomers. And here we go into the bit of class that I wanted to share, but I don't know why it's on this particular tab. That's the wrong tab. Here we go. So back to here and here. Share. Okay, so for those of you who can see, is my screen kind of gray to you?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
So, okay. Thank you for chiming in. You're getting very good at that mute unmute experience. Now let's try reloading. Here we go. And shrink it, go to Zoom, share it again. Ta-da, I got rid of the gray. Welcome. Welcome to Together and Apart to the Future of Jewish Peoplehood, an iEngage curriculum from the Shalom Hartman Institute, Machon Schechter, based both in Jerusalem and in North America, main offices in New York City, but really all over the country. This class is a feature of Congregation Beth Shalom, where I am honored to be a member. And I'm happy to help to increase the offerings in adult Jewish education by bringing you this particular curriculum. Here is the plan for tonight. Okay. We already did a bit of a welcome, which was really mostly about getting into Zoom and being together. In a moment, I'm going to show you the beginning of the video for this unit as provided by the Hartman Institute. That will help set the stage for knowing what iEngage is and what this particular version of iEngage is about. Also, just as a reference point, did anyone already create their Hartman account? And when you went in, you saw more than, so Jerry, I'm going to ask you because I saw your hand up. Did you see more than Together and Apart? Did you also see 2 other iEngage units?
Yes.
Yes, I did.
Yes, you did. Okay, great. So, not for nothing, Rabbi Beals has offered iEngage before. The classes that he offered are available to you because you have this login account ID code, and you are welcome to review any of those materials, right? It's just, and if you needed a refresher, if you took the class with him, it's there as well. Which is to say, as long as you keep that code, you can go back and watch those videos, read those materials, and experience those curricula. But Together and Apart, this number 5 iEngage curriculum is the one we're going to do. It's the most recent, and it builds on Hartman's experience of trying to reach their goals through the iEngage program and having learned from those prior curricula, including the ones that Rabbi Beals taught. Okay, materials. We're going to talk about those and also the syllabus I'll review. And so you can see how the units that are presented in the curriculum are also reflected in the schedule. And I want to remember that, again, one of our larger purposes here is to learn about each other, even though we won't do a whole lot of that today. The idea is really twofold in terms of the curriculum. One is to engage in the ideas for ourselves, but in doing so, to create a kind of community, because the very nature of doing this kind of study is meant to bridge gaps and to help us get past particular divides we may experience elsewhere. After we go through those logistics, we're going to talk about stories. That's the beginning of the whole iEngage Together and Apart curriculum. I will tell you a little bit about my history with Israel as a way of getting into part B here, which is complexity. And I put synchronous and asynchronous. These are buzzwords now that we are in a Zoom world, but the idea really is, right, there is complexity just right now in this very moment. Each of us may be complex. Our relationship to Israel might be complex. Israel may be complex for us. Israel and the United States in general have complexity at any given moment, right? That would be a kind of like in the moment synchronous experience, right? But asynchronously, like across time, there's also complexity. And so what we're going to be looking at in the course is how both our history and traditions and our experiences, right, might affect our attitudes about Israel and Jewish identity and Jewish peoplehood, and how at any given point it may have been complex, and then again over the course of different periods of history, especially our own, right, there is complexity. Our sources, our texts of our tradition are going to speak to that idea, and so we're going to be exploring them throughout the course. Between now and the next class, right, is how we're going to end. I'm going to kind of like prep you for our next class, which is to say that at the end of each class, I'll tell you which of the things I did not include in class you might want to spend more time on, right? Because they touch very closely on the issues we're discussing. Maybe I chose not to spend a lot of time on them because in particular, when I'm combining multiple units, right, I have to make choices. But also, right, to help you spend your time wisely. And the last thing I'll be telling you is that I want you to think about your relationship to Israel, and we'll use some of our upcoming classes to get to know each other a little bit better. One key aspect of getting to know each other is that don't assume that just because, you know, most of you may see each other at one time or another through Beth Shalom, that you know each other. There are people who may only tangentially be a part of the community, and there are people who are joining us, right? And so what I ask is to introduce yourself, right, with your name and maybe one extra something to help us kind of remember you by when you first ask a question or first answer a particular discussion. Any questions about tonight's plan? Okay, I don't have everyone's screens in front of me, but it looks like we're okay. So next slide is we're going to watch Danielle Hartman. So just a little bit about the Hartman Institute. David Hartman, or David Hartman, was a rabbi in Montreal. He moved to Israel. He's a great thinker, philosopher, prolific writer. Many of you may have read articles or his books. And he's pretty famous for two aspects of his thinking. One is articulating this idea of a third covenant, that there was a covenant between sort of like, you know, Abraham and God to form a Jewish people. There was this, and that continued with the Sinai covenant, okay, in terms of how we would be as Jews. There's an additional covenant with David, and that whole biblical period represents one stage of God really being involved in the world. A second stage, a second sort of layer of covenant is the second layer is the rabbinic period, which is that with God absent from our sort of tangible experience of the world, the rabbis engaged in study and argument to bring God into our world. And so we went from being sort of receivers to being kind of partners with God. And then with the establishment of the state of Israel, but also with World War II and the Shoah, the Holocaust, a third stage of Jewish history, a third covenant where we are bringing God into the world. It's not just that we are partners, we are activists in what it means to have God in our world. And for Hartman, what he saw in Israel was a lack of space for pluralism. He felt like very much there were the religious and the secular and nowhere in between. And it's still very much that way, although there are lots of nuances to it, in no small measure because of his work and the work of the institute that he founded. So his son, Danielle, is going to kick off our learning. And Danielle not only grew up literally at the feet of his teacher, David Hartman, his father, but also now is the president of Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Okay, so let me see if I can make sure that I'm sharing the correct screen. And here we go. Share here. Oops, hold on. I forgot with Zoom, you have to press an extra button. Share sound, optimize. Now. Okay, so this is the leader's version. Here is, we're gonna watch just a few minutes. Again, you don't have to watch, you can just listen as well.
Welcome to iEngage 5, entitled Together and Apart, the Future of Jewish Peoplehood. Our goal through iEngage is to create new possibilities for a strong and vibrant connection between Israel and world Jewry. Our work is founded on the belief that there is no Judaism without Jewish peoplehood, and that Jewish identity is enriched and strengthened when Israeli Jews and Jews around the world see each other as essential parts of a larger whole. It's an extraordinary feature of history that the Jewish people have managed to maintain feelings of solidarity and a common sense of peoplehood, despite Jewish communities being separated from one another for centuries by geography, language, and cultural difference. These circumstances may have led us to expect more fragmentation and assimilation, and perhaps even disappearance as a distinct people from the world arena. However, a unique set of external and internal factors help Jews to retain our singular form of peoplehood. Now, following the Holocaust and the establishment of Israel, close to 90% of Jewish life has become more concentrated in two central locations, Israel and North America. Nevertheless, Zionism and the return to our ancient homeland itself in the 20th century served as a major source of Jewish unity, which transcended denominationalism and created deep feelings of common identity and connection. In recent years, however, we are increasingly aware of the fact that Jews in Israel and in North America have embarked on different historical and often ideological trajectories. We are separated not merely by thousands of miles and dramatically dissimilar environments and dangers, but by an ever-growing sense of disparity on issues of identity, religion, politics, values, and priorities. Real questions have been asked about whether Jewish peoplehood, in the way that it has been traditionally understood as a global family, with its self-evident sense of loyalty and relationships, is compelling. At the deepest level, we may be witnessing the crumbling of a meta-narrative that has transcended boundaries and united Jews for generations. The consequences of which could constitute a redefinition of Jewishness in exclusively religious or cultural terms, devoid of its peoplehood dimension, which served as so essential a component for Jewish identity, vitality, and survival. These new realities require that we create new language and paradigms for understanding and maintaining the relationship between Jews in Israel and across the world, and new ways to talk with each other through which this relationship can be reconceived. iEngage 5 is an attempt to do precisely that. In this series, we will embark on an exploration of the concepts of Jewish peoplehood, its most significant contemporary challenges and stumbling blocks, and finally, attempt to suggest different meta-narratives that can unite the Jewish people today. The iEngage methodology is grounded in an aspirational, values-driven discourse, which works to identify and develop values which we can share while respecting our diverse political and ideological positions. Our aim is to create a conversation that transcends partisan divides and which goes to our underlying values instead of their political manifestations. When it comes to the issue of the future of Jewish peoplehood and the consequent relationship between Israel and world Jewry, we will explore which models, conceptual categories, and ideas can sustain peoplehood and a connection to Israel today and into the future. Which assumptions and belief structures need to be reimagined or discarded? How do we embrace our increasingly wide cultural and political differences and still work to create frameworks for relationships that can connect Jews to Israel and to each other?
Okay. So, they don't aim for accomplishing very much, and they don't want us to learn a lot or experience any kind of change in our lives. It's pretty low expectations, right? No. There was a lot that Daniel Hartman articulated there. Part of what he's getting at is that this issue of peoplehood is very big on the agenda for what it means to be a Jewish community, how Israel and America can learn to talk to each other at the Jewish level and at political levels. And how is it that we might, right, also be able to get past politics to things that allow us, or to ideas that allow us to really talk to each other and get to know each other. Very important to note, this curriculum was created in early 2019, which actually means it was created in 2018, and then they did all the filming and they launched it before the pandemic. And before, right, all the peace accords between Israel and multiple of its sort of regional neighbors. Morocco is not exactly a neighbor, right? Neither is the UAE, right? And they made this curriculum, right, without reference in particular to some of the thinking around what it would mean for there to be now 4 elections in Israel, nor the most recent presidential election, and what it might mean for our country. I will tell you that some of the ideas, particularly when we discuss nationalism, will touch on, right, how it is that we got to be tribal or divided, and even within the Jewish community, to not all, right, act or talk the same way, because actually we often believe the same things, right? But what are those beliefs, and how are they grounding our perspectives such that we might reach different conclusions? The goal of the class is to really take us through all these different layers. And again, this is not the first time that Hartman has tried to create this kind of conversation. It just so happens, right, that the conversation is all the more poignant today in ways that it may not have been even just a year and a half ago, or 2 years ago, if you want to go back to January 2019 and accept that we're actually no longer in 2020. So as we begin the new year, one of the things we're going to be exploring, right, is how it is that some of these ideas articulated in the curriculum from the Hartman Institute can help us. So let me go back to our PowerPoint and oops. And make sure that we are all on the same sort of page. So again, that video in its entirety, not just the first 4 minutes and 43 seconds, but 50 plus minutes, right, is available to you in the Hartman online portal that this registration page that I emailed to, I believe, all of you. If you didn't get it, please, put in the chat that you didn't get it, or send me an email letting me know you didn't get it. But by going to online.hartman.org.il for Israel, you can use this community registration code and access, again, all the videos and a PDF, a kind of uneditable version of all the texts for this particular course, and also for the other courses that Rabbi Beals has taught at Beth Shalom in the past. That is one version of the materials, of how to access our materials. Somebody asked me, and I want to be clear, you do not actually need to go and register with Hartman Online. They would like that, I imagine. I'm just, full disclosure, that you'll be right on their email list that you can then unsubscribe from, but they will know you as a participant by you registering to have access to all the materials. Okay, and Dennis will take care of you after class. So you don't need to create the Hartman Online account, but right, if you do, you get not only all of these materials, and you also get the other classes. And frankly, I think the Hartman Institute has lots to offer. They, in particular, during the pandemic, have put multiple of the teaching offerings that they normally would do out for the public at large. And so you can sample learning with Hartman throughout the year and be notified about all the different offerings. There is also a print version that I emailed in that one big email with the Zoom link, the online portal registration, and this particular link. But what I will be doing after class is trying to send you a link to a recording of this class and to this PowerPoint. It's Google Slides, just for what it's worth. So you'll be able to actually just click this link if you seem to have missed that. If you seem to have missed the email before. I'm just going to stop sharing to make it very clear. Spotlight. And stop share. Okay, if you order that print edition, okay, it looks like this is sort of like 8.5 by 11. It's glossy, it's very nice. It has all the pages, right, and pictures. And it's a pretty decent size font. It's mostly, I would say, 12 point, maybe a little larger. The Hebrew is there for texts that appear in Hebrew. Okay, and that being said, right, you don't need this, right, because the PDFs are available online, and the text that we're going to discuss in class, I am going to put up on the screen for us to kind of dwell on. This is if you are the kind of learner who likes to, right, have a hard copy that you can take notes on, or you like to read ahead so you know what to listen for, or what new is going to come out of class. Or after class, you like to review and you want everything right there in your hands as opposed to on a screen, right? That being said, the print edition is far cheaper than printing the 300 pages on your own. I downloaded the file and took it to Staples, and it was like, I don't know, $60 or something like that. But this print edition, which takes about 10 days to get to you by mail, is somewhere between $10 and $15, depending on what sale the company is offering. Okay. I mentioned that class will include, as I've been doing so far, right, this sort of PowerPoint kind of presentation. So I will be putting things on the screen for you to see, including the source material, including the pieces of video that I think it's most relevant for you to hear or to watch. And right, either because you were in class and you got distracted, or you couldn't make it to class. Let's be honest, 8 sessions, something might happen. We've learned to expect the unexpected in the past year or so. You might miss a class, and it's okay. We will miss you, but you don't have to miss us so much as you have an opportunity, again, to watch a video recording of the Zoom. And likewise, have access to the PowerPoint with any particulars of what we spent time on, so you can follow along. Questions about materials? No. Oh, great. Okay, so I'm going to share now the, Lori, I'm going to answer your question in a moment. Let me go back to my PowerPoint. Here we go. So the syllabus, right, if you were to go to the online portal, or if you printed the book, or if you're just here with us, you can see that the way that Hartman designed this particular class, parts 1 and 2 include 11 different units. And if we go to part 3, it goes all the way to 14 units. But I've condensed it into 8. Now, I want you to know that I did this in consultation with the people at Hartman, right? So I took their advice, and I looked at the curriculum myself, and I think this will work, right? It's a little bit ambitious when we get to the challenge, to part 2, the challenges to Jewish peoplehood. But for example, we're off next week, so that the community game night can happen. But the week after, when we come back together, units 2 and 3, the Judaism of being and Judaism of becoming, right, very naturally can go together. One of the things that Danielle Hartman thinks is like, the more time you spend and the slower we go, like if we spread this out over 2 years, right, we could really experience, right, the crossing of the divides and whatever else. My sense is that may be true, and we get the same sort of bang for the buck by going a little bit faster, that we can accomplish the same goals by focusing our attention and bringing some of these topics together, because they are interrelated. So I renamed being as ethics, and becoming as beliefs, all right, as a kind of frame for what these 2 kinds of Judaism might be. Universalism and particularism, unit 4, will be our last class in part 1, the last class in January. So we have this week, we're off for a week, and then we're back to back. Okay, and then there's a kind of pause, and actually February 15th is a Monday. That's why there's an asterisk. It's President's Day, so we're still kind of in the weekend mode, but that happens to be a Monday. And there we'll cover units 5, 6, and 7. So nationalism, ultranationalism, fascism, the moral implications of nationalism, or Jewish nationalism in particular, and Israel's nation-state law and its ramifications. Again, folks at the Hartman Institute think that much of that can be combined pretty easily. And the same thing with anti-Semitism, both as a divisive force and its sort of reincarnation as anti-Zionism. So when is anti-Zionism actually anti-Semitism, and when is it not? We'll try to cover that all together February 21st. On February 28th, we're going to get into dual loyalties and identity politics. So units 10 and 11, we're going to put together. And I'll just put this out there that, like, you know, again, this curriculum was created in 2019. But like just last week, Jonathan Pollard flew to Israel. And all of the arguments around these sort of issues of dual loyalty and identity politics from back when he was first convicted, or during the Clinton presidency when people wanted him to be pardoned, or at least, you know, his sentence commuted, or even more recently, right, when he was finishing up his term, his 30-year sentence. What did he, it's just one example of this question of dual loyalty, represent, and how do we talk about him, and what did that say about us when we were having that conversation, right? So this is very current stuff, even though it was designed to be a conversation from even 2 years ago. The last part, the last third of the class is about new relationship models for Jewish peoplehood. And so I just combined 12 and 13, these different metaphors, if you will, family as a metaphor, consumer as a metaphor, this idea of shared believers, partners, and investors, all these different ways of thinking about what being Jewish might mean. We're going to explore on March 7th. And then on March 14th, we're going to bring it all together with this new concept, this meta-narrative idea of what it means to be at home. Because what we're going to figure out today in our first lesson, when I finally get to it, is that the Jewish people went from no home to one home and now two homes. And what we do with that two home narrative and experience is the key question for us today. Okay, so that is the syllabus. I'm about to get into the text material. And here is a good opportunity for me to say something about myself as a teacher, okay, and to kind of maybe share a little bit of my story to kind of let you in on what this means for me before we get into the actual material. So I know that people learn in different ways. I've seen it when I've been in the pulpit. I've seen it on college campuses. I've seen it in schools like Albert Einstein Academy. Everyone has different modes of learning that work better for them. So can I tell you that you should watch a video in advance of class or that you should watch it after class? The answer really is like, I don't know, but you might, okay? If you like to, and have the time, right, to immerse yourself in a conversation that maybe is going to require digging deeper, right? Then watch everything in advance and look over the material. There's a lot of neuroscience out there about like, if you want to retain information, knowing what questions to ask before you get into the class is helpful, right? I will try to do that anyway, right? But you might want to look at the material in advance. You do not need to, okay? What about watching it afterwards? Again, I will make recommendations. For example, the video lecture for this unit, for this week's unit, Tal Becker's talk is good, but I think the source material is better. That being said, each week, each unit has a lecture followed by an interview. And generally speaking, the lecturer has two people sit with him or her and have a dialogue. And so in this week in particular, I found that dialogue to be really meaningful, but I don't think it helps you understand the material beforehand, right? So it's great to have after, and I'll recommend it to you. You'll see that on the last slide. Do you need to have the material in front of you? If it's hard for you to look at a screen, yeah, it's great for you to have a printout of either that week's materials and you can print a little bit at a time, or again, you can have the source book, or you might choose to have multiple devices. And so like your iPad or your phone may have the text downloaded and ready for you, while on the screen I'm sharing the text for everybody. Let me just take a quick look. Any questions about preparing or materials before after class? All right. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, and I'm still spotlighted. Okay, so I loved this. I loved this particular opening sequence in many ways because it kind of helped me understand myself, and this is what my hope is for you. All right. I grew up that in Hebrew school, my Hebrew language teachers were Israelis who had made Yerida. Instead of going up, making Aliyah to Israel, they came down from Israel spiritually, and they lived in Houston, Texas, of all places. And they brought this idea of like the kibbutz, where they had grown up and their family still lived, as a kind of socialist paradise, right? All about reclaiming not just the land of Israel as a Jewish state, but also the land as a source of Jewish being. They didn't talk much about celebrating Jewish holidays like Sukkot or Shavuot, the counting of the Omer with actual sheaves of them. They didn't talk about biblical holidays or Jewish holidays as like being able to be lived out, right? That they left that piece out of it. But it left me with this sort of like idea that even today, back in the 1980s, even in that world of today, any American Jew could be a pioneer in Israel, right? And then I would go on different kinds of teen trips and have different teen education experiences, which ended up focusing on the Intifada, the first Intifada, and began to deal with this idea that the world was against the Jews by being against Israel, right? That Israel has a strong state, and this continued well beyond the late 80s into today. It's still going on today. And that was a way of understanding what it meant to be Jewish, was to stand up for the way in which other people made Jews exceptional, expecting a higher moral standard, and calling Israel out to that higher standard, fairly or unfairly, mostly unfairly, right? And it wasn't until much later, as I was getting ready for rabbinical school and lived in Israel for a summer, and then during rabbinical school lived in Israel for a year, and throughout rabbinical school, so even for summers leading into that full year in Israel, working at Jewish summer camp with Israelis on staff, that my relationship began to change to be about actual face-to-face interactions. It's one of the most important aspects of what it has meant for this community to have a shaliach or a shlicha, to have a face of Israel present in our work, in our community, to humanize, right, a whole country. And it's not fair to that individual, which is why it's so great when that person is here for a couple of years, we get to know them, they get to know us, and then we get somebody new and we start that relationship again. We realize that it's like Israel is made up of actual people, right? And Israelis get to learn that North American Jews are made of actual people too. And that is something that like is sort of an end goal for this class when we talk about peoplehood, that we're going to be embedded in certain ideologies, and that's going to come from our experiences, right? And that experience might be framed by an Israeli, it might be framed by an American Jew, and those different people might be our family members, and it might be our leaders or teachers, right? Or it might just be, right, a good friend. Each of us has our own stories. And so, you know, my like homework for you for 2 weeks from now is to think about like who or what story in your life experience most influenced the way you think about Israel, right? Was it that Hebrew school teacher back when you were a young person, right? Was it somebody you met who is from Israel? Was it, right, somebody here in the United States or in Canada, if you were there, who spoke passionately and you heard this speech, or you interacted with this person and they shaped the very nature of what Israel means to you, right? Was it your own child who made certain decisions about what Israel means to them that has changed what Israel means to you. Like all those possibilities, right? Draw on the complexity and the individuality of what Jewish peoplehood might mean when we talk about this notion of Israel and America as two homes. So again, just thinking about my story, thinking about each of you, and right then looking at these sources. So I'm going to take you into the text so you can see that, like, you know what, even for the first Jew, this was not an open and shut case. Okay, so let me share the source book, and here we go. Okay, so we've got to get past the acknowledgements and the teachers, amazing faculty, to our stories of Jewish peoplehood. Unit 1, the sources include a passage from the Passover Haggadah. It's a great place to start because, frankly, most Jews in the world, right, are familiar enough with the Haggadah, even if we're not familiar with the particular passage that the Hartman Institute highlighted. Then we're going to look at Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 11, to see a little bit about Pharaoh. And we're going to look at Esther very briefly to see how it is that Haman in particular, right, talks about Jewish people. And then Genesis 12. Genesis 12, two different texts, only 10 verses apart. Okay, this is the Abraham piece that I was just speaking of. Then we're going to get a different version of complication, Jeremiah and Psalms. Jeremiah, my namesake, but like a particular passage that you probably have heard in some form or fashion, particularly when Rabbi Beals or somebody else tells you the Jewish thing is to vote. Jeremiah says, right, participate in the politics of your local community. And then we'll address Jacob Blaustein in his particular setting of 1950. This all, by the way, will be framed by this a lens that Yuval Noah Harari articulates in his book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. You can see it here, page 8. It's one-page synopsis of this key idea, but it's something you know viscerally from Passover, which is that, like, Jews are storytellers. And the way you know you're kind of like part of the Jewish story is to tell the Jewish story, and we do it at Passover. In fact, Bechol Dor Vador, Chayav Adam Lirot Et Atzmo Ki'ilu Hu Yatsa Mitzrayim. In every generation, a person is obligated to see themselves as if he or she was personally redeemed from Egypt. And the way we do that is by sitting at the table or sitting in the living room and telling the story of the Passover, Exodus, and transition from slavery to freedom. All right, and we say it, this one particular passage, Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, right? And the Lord our God took us out from there with a strong hand and outstretched arm. And if God had not done that, then we, our children's children would have remained enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. And even if all of us were wise and understanding and knowing of Torah, we would still be obligated to discuss the Exodus from Egypt. Everyone discussing the Exodus at length is praiseworthy. So the rabbis here are playing on this whole idea. And they chose as their source text a passage from Deuteronomy that actually we know from other source material, right? That everyone would know. So even before we had a Haggadah, we had this passage that Jews would recite on Shavuot when they brought their first fruits. You would do a call and response with the Levite priest. He was, repeat after me. My father was a wandering Aramaean, right? He sojourned in Israel, and then had to go to Egypt, and we became slaves, and we were brought with an outstretched arm and mighty hand. Like that whole passage, right, is something that Jews who made pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the holidays and for Shavuot in particular would know by heart. That was the central text of the Haggadah story. And the Haggadah goes one step further to say, not only were we slaves, we would still be slaves, and we have to tell this story. And the more you tell it, the more praiseworthy you are. Can I enlarge? Aha. Okay, so let me see if I can make this a little bit larger. I can do this. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So I'll keep it large as we continue on. Okay. So the key to Jewish peoplehood is telling a story, and Yuval Noah Harari, his book is very good, and he has a follow-up to it as well. He goes out of his way to make the case that what distinguishes human beings sort of from other creatures is that while other creatures can create community and communicate, like as a pack, and maybe, I don't know, I think chimpanzees can have a community of 50 before things start to break down. Okay. Humans have gotten to a global scale, and the way we do it is by telling stories about ourselves, right? And when we talk about nationalism, the stories we tell about ourselves, that's going to be a key idea. So the Jews have been telling this story about ourselves. The foundational text isn't that Abraham left Haran and went to Canaan because God said, go and I will show you. The story that is foundational to the Jews isn't, that Joseph was betrayed by his brothers and pulled himself up by his bootstraps or by his natural talent. He was, an early version of a Nobel Prize, Albert Einstein kind of a Jewish genius, and he became second to Pharaoh. No, the foundational text is that we were once slaves, right? And by the way, another foundational story could be David was our king, and he united Solomon united the different tribes into, right, a nation state in the ancient world. Our foundational story could be Jesus being persecuted by the Romans. That could have been our foundational story, right? And in some ways it is, but we took it a different direction. The foundational story is slavery to freedom. And we have to see what else in our story, right, has influenced our sense, not just of belonging to a community, right, but of being at home, so that we can kind of localize that community. Because it'll come up later in the course, it is important to realize that the first time that we are called a people is by Pharaoh, and this is the Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph. Okay, and by the way, historically, the Pharaoh who knew Joseph was likely to be a Hyksos Pharaoh instead of one of the sort of more Nile-based pharaohs, and so there was a lot going on in Egyptian history that is suggestive as to why this all happened. But this Pharaoh calls us B'nai Israel, not B'nai Israel, not the children of Israel, not like, like the Jewish people, right? B'nai Israel, the people, the children of Israel, right? And so that is the beginning of our being distinguished as other within the context of, right, this particular Pharaoh's Egyptian society, that we're too numerous, and whatever we've been doing in the locus of larger Egypt towards the north where we might have been living was somehow different. And Haman takes that a step further, right? So he says it's not just that that we are different in our ethnicity, right? But that we are different because, right, Mordecai wouldn't kneel or bow low. And Haman goes on, he said he saw that, right, it made him angry that we wouldn't behave like Persians. And so he plotted to do away with all the Jews. I'm sure the Hebrew is a little bit more spicy than that. And so Haman says to King Achashverosh, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among other peoples in all the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of any other people and who do not obey the king's laws. Okay. And you know what? I'm going to keep going because it's not in your interest to tolerate them. Okay. So this is going to set up again next week's Judaism of being and of becoming. Like, what is it about who we are ethnically or in our kind of being, right, versus our becoming, our actions and our beliefs and how it is that we live. And it puts into context this idea that, right, anti-Semitism is real. And even when anti-Semitism might be kind of like on the lull, right? So which is to say that, like, look, Esther made it to the beauty pageant. So it wasn't that bad for Jews in Persia, right? Mordechai was pretty high up. He was like what we would call in the later Middle Ages, a court Jew, okay? We were tolerated, right? But being tolerated is not the same thing as being at home, as being comfortable, right? So, and that's what makes America unique, is that even though we're in the minority, in theory, the promise of America is that all minorities are not just tolerated, they belong, right? And that is what makes today's world, the contemporary choices that we have, a new situation. Okay, so just to make sure it's clear to everybody, we, from the very beginning, struggle with this idea of Israel being our home, because, right, Avram is told, Lech Lecha. Here it is, Lech Lecha. My highlighter is not working so well. Lech Lecha, Me'artzecha, Mimoladecha. Like, leave your land where you were born, the house of your father, and go to a land that I'm going to show you. And I'll promise to make your name great. You'll be a great nation, right? The Jews will thrive in Israel, as it's supposed to be, right? But 8 verses after the promise, there was a famine, right? So like in between verse 2 and verse 10, Abraham has to actually make the journey, get there, like figure out what's going to go on, and there's a famine. And what does Avram do? He leaves. He goes to Egypt, of all places. And in fact, Isaac is going to repeat this journey to Egypt. So you know what? That promise about Israel being our home and being a place of safety, security, of being a place where we can be normal and like a country like any other country, or exceptional, you know, like just our Jewish state, it was not even at the very beginning able to be sustained initially. Avram left, and by the way, while he was away, he was enriched. He got lots of cattle and herds, and he was blessed by the people he encountered, even though it didn't go so well with Sarah being played off as his half-sister, but wife. Like, that was not good, right? I'm not saying he was a paragon of excellence. I'm just saying, while away, he prospered. Not in Israel did he prosper. He prospered out of Israel, and then he brought that prosperity back to Israel. Okay. So again, that idea that like Israel is the locus of what everything positive is going to be was always a mixed bag. That not for nothing too, most of the Bible and early rabbinic literature plays out this idea that Israel is the one part of the Middle East where there isn't much in the way of natural resources in terms of water. Like, you're highly dependent on rain, which means you're highly dependent on God, right? And so it's not like there's the Nile River. You don't have the Tigris and Euphrates, right? You can raise animals, but like even they are going to need to graze on, right, different kinds of crops. So Israel is this place that is different, right? And what a miracle it is today, by the way, that like Israel's making water from the Mediterranean, from the sky, right? And using drip irrigation to make water go farther. We found underwater wells that are brackish and using that, and solar power, right? And many other ways in which to expand the idea of what a natural resource is, right? That's pretty amazing, given that, right, Israel itself, the land of Canaan, initially even wasn't such a great place. I've been reading a lot about the prophet Jeremiah, and one of the things that I learned is that, like, he has like a really long life story where his prophecy went, you know, pretty much unheard most of the time, but he saw pretty early on that whatever it was that the Jews were doing, right, when it was under Josiah, who was trying to make everyone like do the right thing, not enough people were doing the right thing. So he was yelling, "Get on board with, you know, King Josiah," right? Because his reforms are really good. And if we don't do a really good job, then I've had this prophecy: the Babylonians are going to come and they're going to kick us out and put us into exile. And he kept saying that because the other rulers after Josiah, they were interested in making treaties with the Egyptians, and because, you know, there was this sort of power battle that was taking place, and he was always, right, not taken seriously. But we have his text, right? He had Baruch be his scribe and write down his prophecies. So and when he thought about Babylonian exile, he thought it was God's purpose for us, and he thought, you know, this is a good thing because it will allow us, right, to stop running to Egypt and to start trusting God, right? To say, like, right, we were doing the wrong thing, we deserve some kind of punishment or exile. Let's leave. The Babylonians are the right people to leave with, because, by the way, Cyrus is going to let us come back, right? All this sort of prophetic, forward-thinking perspective. And so he says this amazing thing about being in Babylonia. And here it is in verse 5. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their fruit. Take wives and beget sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, do not decrease. In exile, outside of Israel, proliferate, prosper, do amazingly. That's your home. And not only should you make it your home and like plant gardens and houses, right? But like, look, seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you and pray to the Lord on its behalf. Pray to God for Babylonia, not for Israel. Don't be thinking back to a place that you're sent away from. Think forward to where you are, right? For in its prosperity you shall prosper. Now, technically the Hebrew here is Bishlomah yeh lachem shalom. So prosperity is really shalom, but that sense of completeness, having everything you want, that is what the goal was. Jeremiah says this, okay? And what's interesting is that this text pretty much historically would exist simultaneously with the next one, which is also famous. Al Neharot Bavel, by the rivers of Babylon, I sat down and wept. Right? And what were we weeping for? We were weeping for Sion, for Zion. Our captors would ask us for songs. They would torment us, right? They said, "Ha ha, you are not in charge of yourself. You are not free. And you are not free because, right, we took you away." So literally at kind of the same time, we have this idea that on the one hand, Babylonia is our future. And by the way, only 30,000 Jews left Babylonia when Cyrus allowed us back to build the second temple. Many, many tens of thousands of Jews stayed in Babylonia, right, and became, as time went on, hundreds of years later, about 1,000 years later, right, the greatest academies of rabbinic thinking, and Surah Pumbedita and many other, the rabbis of the Talmud, right? They wrote the Talmud in Babylonia. So that exists side by side with, we could never give up on Israel. That was the height of our belonging and relationship to God. We need that, okay? So, and that has been true, or was true, I should say, from, right, 586 BCE until 1948. 2,000 years, 2,500 years roughly, it was true that at one and the same time, we longed for Israel. We thought about Israel. We faced Israel when we prayed. We like a Rabbi, was it Rabbi Nachman who said, every step I take, I'm taking a step towards Israel, right? Israel was a part of a kind of imagination that went beyond like a dream. It was a hope that was meant to keep us alive through persecution, through times of difficulty. And at the same time, there were long periods of our history where we were very comfortable being tolerated by the local population throughout Europe in stages, in this duke, this king, that queen. We were allowed and tolerated to live and to succeed, right? Until they didn't like us anymore. And then we left, and then we came back until America. And America at first, pretty complicated. Peter Stuyvesant didn't like those Jews coming to New York in groups. Whew, tried to get us to leave, right? But the Dutch, because we were involved in a lot of commerce in Amsterdam, they said, no, you have to make a home for the Jews, right? And as America came to be, in particular with the First Amendment, right, the right to practice our religion freely, a place where, in theory, all minorities could be at home, not just tolerated, but belonging. We would be citizens in ways that we had not been in other countries in our history. America came to be, right, this new home, and Israel wasn't available to us. So like we might long for it, but it was all a theory until again 1948, when it was not just a theory, it was a very real place. And what's interesting is to see that Americanness play out in Jacob Blaustein's words. He claims that Israel is not meant to play the role of ingathering Jews from all over the world, because that implies this sort of false belief that Jewish life outside of Israel is without spiritual value, cultural significance, or hope of personal or group security. So he says, and he was the head of the he was like a reform representative within the American Jewish community. He says, we repudiate vigorously the suggestion that American Jews are in exile. The future of American Jewry, our children and our children's children, is entirely linked with the future of America. We have no alternative, and we want no alternative. Our children and our children's children goes right back to the Haggadah, where we're supposed to like tell the story of going from Egypt to Israel, slavery to freedom, exile to belonging. And he says, no, we belong here. And that sets up the problem that the course is meant to highlight for us, right? Is that like, we really have every reason, even when things are going bad and they're, like Charlottesville, as much as it was about race, it was also anti-Semitism. All the other recent events that have been highlighted and poo, like the horrible tragedies in Pittsburgh and Poway, where Jews are being shot while praying, right? Even those anti-Semitic acts, America in general, in theory, is not only a place of safety, but it's a place where we belong. It's a place where we are active participants in every part of society. And so we have everything that a home might encompass. And in particular, Tal Becker in his lecture kind of highlights these three things: safety, normalcy, right? Like, to be a Jew is for the most part normal, right? We can go to Ivy League schools now. Wasn't always that way, I know, right? But we can go to Ivy League schools. We can get a job in pretty much any field, and we can also be exceptional, right? So that we're allowed to practice our unique practices in our own way, and still be part of this greater whole, right? Obviously, with the creation of Israel in 1948, that becomes possible in the land of Israel for the first time. And what we need to explore is that relationship, particularly coming out of sort of, say, 1950, through the 70s into the 80s, but like we're going to come to the current era as well. Okay, I went a little longer today with teaching and the lecture part because of all the introductory material. Than I plan on doing most times going forward. So most weeks, my plan will be to kind of conclude the teaching piece by 7:30 and to leave the last half hour for any questions or comments. But in this case, because of all that introductory stuff, like I ran over a little bit. That being said, we do have some time between now and 8 o'clock, which is going to be our kind of like chance for everyone to go back and do their own thing. Comments, questions, things that you're walking away with already. And remember to unmute yourself and introduce yourself. We're all speechless. Okay. Think about it. Think about it. And right, as promised, here is a way to extend the conversation in your own headspace. I highly recommend that page 8 in the source book, so you can see a little bit more about that whole notion of story being a driver of how it is that we create belonging, right, and have these larger societal issues. You don't have to read the whole book, Sapiens, there, but again, that one page is very helpful. And to keep the conversation going and to ground it in the lived lives of two particular individuals, not the Tal Becker's lecture, but if you skip ahead to the 33rd minute, Tal Becker interviews Rabbi Angela Buchdahl and, oh gosh, forgive me, an Israeli woman, Dotan, I forget the rest of her name, and fair warning, she speaks in Hebrew with English subtitles. So again, everyone learns differently. I didn't want to kind of throw that on you the first class. In your own speed, you can watch that video and read the subtitles. They create this beautiful contrast. For those of you who don't know who Rabbi Angela Buchdahl is, she is a senior rabbi at Central Synagogue in New York City. I knew her when she was just a cantor at Westchester Reformed Temple in Scarsdale, New York. She is Asian American, and she talks about what it meant to be Korean, because she grew up there, and American, and to not be at home, and then to figure out what it meant to create a sense of being at home, and how Judaism gave her that, but how when she went to Israel, they didn't know what to make of her. She's not white, or kind of, I'll just say brown for like Mizrahi Jews of the Middle East, right? She doesn't have Arab coloring. So who is she? Why is she here? And she's Reform Jewish. So like, is she, again, in that sort of either like religious, meaning Orthodox, or secular? Like, what is she? How did she navigate that in her own story? And then the other woman, Dotan, she grew up on a kibbutz, and she articulates what it meant to be like a Jew by being Israeli, right? Without reference to Jewish, to religious practice or to faith. And they also talk about how many Israelis, like when they come here and their kids go to Jewish day school, right? Suddenly they're exposed to what Judaism could look like, and they're like, ooh, I never knew that, right? So that dialogue between Tal Becker, the scholar, and these two individuals really helps to kind of sharpen that question that I wanted to leave you with, which is like, what is your relationship to Israel? How do you think of yourself and your attachment, lack thereof, relationship, or whatever other words you might use for how you think about Israel? And in particular, right, who was most influential in how you think about Israel now? Again, someone from your past, someone from your just your community, someone who's in a leadership position, or someone who's in your family, or someone you encountered. Think about that for next week. And that's our class for tonight. Again, questions or comments, I'm here. I saw that I need to email a few of you different things like the syllabus, or you might not have gotten the original email. But anything else?
I believe her name is Rabbi Dotan Arieli.
Thank you. Thank you for the last name, Rabbi Arieli. Yes. And that's the
Thank
woman
you very
in
much,
this.
Jeremy.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very
Thank
nice
you.
on a Sunday evening. I look forward to the next one.
Remember, next
Thank
week, go play games with the community, but the week after we'll be back for class.
Jeremy.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Yes, Fred.
Jeremy, Fred Manis. Just a comment. I've watched Rabbi Buchtal services from Central Synagogue quite often because I don't have access to one
Right.
very often up here, and I highly recommend her. I suggest that people go and watch her on TV Friday evening.
And I want to just, like, in particular, her High Holiday sermon on race
Yes.
was right then published in, I think, the Jewish Week. Just Google it. It is worth listening to or reading. She definitely deserves that kind of, the pulpit she occupies is seen as one of the biggest and most important in the country, and she's there for a reason. So if not a regular Friday night, then at least that sermon in particular.
I think it's on YouTube too.
Yes.
Yes, I'd highly recommend it. It's really an eye opener. And thank you, Rabbi Winaker.
Absolutely.
Can you hear me, Jeremy?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Seth.
So a really basic, like, probably should have gotten this out of Hebrew School 101. Why are we always talking about, the Jewish people as if we weren't the first people? Like, I mean, hasn't the rest of the world followed us? And that aren't we the first human beings?
He's all.
No.
So,
First human beings.
I mean, aren't Adam and Eve Jewish?
No. In fact, the Jewish tradition went.
All right, Richard Levin. I see it not in there.
So Rashi asked the question, why do we start with creation? Why do we start with Adam and Eve? Why include Noah? Right, and the whole point is that God is the creator of everything, and the Jewish people are one of many people, right? And the fact that Abraham came to understand the oneness of God while living amongst an idolatrous community, Nimrod, and the descendants of the Tower of Babel story, helps to set in context that we are, yes, in other language of the Bible, the treasured people, the chosen people, but we are one of many peoples, right? And then the question becomes, what is our purpose, right? Given that we perhaps first, but not necessarily, only, came to understand the idea of the oneness of God and that's implications for how we behave towards other people, right? And towards God in particular. So
we're not really a people until what, Moses?
Yeah, pretty much, right? Before that, we're a tribe. We're the children of, literally the children of Jacob, who then becomes Israel. He changes his name. We're Bnei Yisrael. We're the children of Israel. And when we open the book of Exodus, we're listed by tribal relationship to Reuben and Shimon and Levi and Issachar and Zvulun, and right all the way down, because right, we haven't come together as a people until Pharaoh calls us a people, and there is that influence from the outside that helps us to begin to kind of group think And some would argue it's not actually until Sinai, until we accept the covenant, that we become a people, because when we're living under Pharaoh, we're kind of like an ethnic group, right? Kind of tribal, but a little bit bigger than that. But it's not until we have our own law that we take into sort of consideration this idea of being, you know, our own people or our own nation. Marla, you had your hand up.
Thank you.
Or Jerry.
Yeah, I'm Jerry Colvin, better known in these parts as Marla Colvin's father. Anyway, you know, you
Now
can
you're known as Ross Cooper's father-in-law.
That too also, but I'm better known as Marla's father. Anyway, I've read *Sapiens* and I read the books by Harari, but there's another book I read about 15, 20 years ago called *Unsettled*. It's by Ivan O'Connor, and it basically says that the Jewish people arose out of the indigenous Canaanite tribes that were in Palestine and Israel at the time, and makes the point that there's no historical reference to Moses, no historical reference to the Exodus. It also points out that if you look at most of the laws of the Abrahamic tribes, they came from the Code of Hammurabi. And of course, that's where they came from, Mesopotamia. So he makes, it doesn't reduce my commitment to Judaism any, but it does make the case that the Jewish people arose out of the indigenous Canaanite tribes in Israel, Palestine.
Jerry, I love that.
And that is the Exodus from Egypt.
I love that because, okay, number one, I'm always interested in scholarly stuff. It's just like I'm that kind of a person, and intellectually, I like to kind of see what the background story is. But it makes this class even more important. This idea of the stories we tell about ourselves, right, can overcome whatever that truth or lack of truth may be, right? Let's just say that scholar is correct, that there was no like Jacob with 12 sons and a daughter, and we didn't go to Egypt, or we did go to Egypt. Doesn't matter. Like as David Wolpe once gave the big sermon, like the Exodus didn't happen and I don't care, right? I mean, or I can still believe it. It's sort of like his point. The myth, the fact that we tell this story, that it has bridged whatever divides into creating a Jewish people, that is what's important. And I just want to put this out there too. When you think about America and where we are right now, like one of the bigger arguments that's going on in academic circles among historians is like, why did we stop talking about what America means? Because when we stopped talking about what America means, we allowed for this tribalism, for this like division of our country. And if we could get back to the American story, and maybe our leaders should do that, but they haven't yet. I mean, it doesn't matter which party, they haven't created a grand American narrative in decades, right? If we could do that, then we could become an American people. Something about the Jewish tradition has allowed us to create a unifying story, right, that allows us to have reached this point in history. And the question will be, right, how do we have a story that says you should be at home in America because, just like Jeremiah said about Babylonia, it's good for you, it's what God wants. I mean, I honestly think that like there is a legitimate Jewish argument for that, okay? And you should be in Israel because that's the promised land. That's the land that is the only place in the world with a Jewish majority, right? Where we can be free, safe, normal, and exceptional, right? And so we're going to be trying to kind of find a new story to encompass those two sort of ongoing stories that have kind of helped us to reach this point and overcome stories of, or realities of times in which the Jewish people weren't so much a people. We were like, you know, indigenous tribes. Carol, I saw your hand up before. You look frozen though. Carol, did you have a question? Maybe not. Other comments or questions before we wrap up? I'm telling you, this class is very low stakes. We're we're not going to solve any world issues, and we're not going to stretch our minds at all. There's a lot to look forward to.
Good start.
Yes. All right. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great night. And when we come back in 2 weeks, we'll address the Judaism of being and the Judaism of becoming, right? So that we can get a sense of, again, like where we root our story, so that we can then take on these issues of like, well, what does that mean about what it means to be a Jewish people?
Take
Shavuot
night.
Tov.
Shavuot Tov, everyone.
Thank you.